33 burgers, 33 fries, 33 shakes, 33 hot dogs, 33 pounds.
Welcome back to the series. It's been a mere 25 months since I talked about the first part of this monster of all Meshuggah tracks, but I think it might already be time to get back to it. This video will take us through the rest of the riffs in this track up until the ambient part that leads into the album's final act. So let's get into it. We left off with this riff return from In Death Is Life, which finishes with a hard cut to a new texture, which is this much quieter, snaky guitar part. This is yet another new rhythmic pattern for this song, which goes long, 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 short, long, 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 short, long, long, short, short, and then repeats. And as usual for a lot of Meshuggah's music, the longs are 3 pulses and the shorts are 2 pulses. So it's 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3, and that got back to the beginning. I'm going to bring back the way of representing these types of strings of longs and shorts that I used in the last In Death Is Death video, where I say 4-1 is 4 longs and 1 short. So this pattern in this notation becomes 4-1, 4-1, 2-2. This is one of the easier rhythmic patterns to track on this in these last couple songs because, well, for one, it repeats, which is nice, and it's not that long, and the changing pitches make it easier to hear like an actual melody in this, which I think kind of, reinforces the rhythmic pattern. There are 2 different pitch patterns that fill this rhythmic pattern out, each one starting on the same note and generally descending, but they're slightly different from each other. Here is that. So this longer unit, this whole phrase, this whole riff, guitar riff pattern, 2 times through the rhythm pattern or 1 time through the entire pitch pattern, lasts for 76 16th notes. This repeats 3 times completely and then 1 time partially to add up to 256 16th notes, which is 16 measures of 4/4, of course. Phew, all is right in the world. Halfway through this, another guitar layer enters playing a pattern that's almost the same as the hypnotic half and whole steps thing from the middle of Mind's Mirrors, but this time with only a repeated
half step.
So it's just 1 measure, 4 beats on 1 note, and then 4 beats on a note.
Half step.
Up. This whole 16 measure structure repeats, and now with drums and bass entering too, and filling out this fusion-y kind of sounding texture that, as Yogev pointed out in one of his videos from a while ago, is pretty unusual for Meshuggah. For one thing, the drums are not playing the typical backbeat pattern with cymbals on the beat and snare on beat 3. Instead, they're following the guitar pattern exactly as. It's etc. This makes it tricky to listen for that background 4/4, but it's still there, and it's actually not that hard to hear if you tune into that second guitar layer. But I find that's kind of hard to square with the other one because it's, you know, it's a little tricky to hear the glue, the beat that's connecting these two things. So that whole structure repeats again, that whole 16 measures with the, you know, 3 and a little bit repetitions of the riff pattern. And then the whole hypermetric structure is interrupted slightly for maybe the first time. I can't remember if this happened already on this album, but there's one extra bar of silence inserted after this riff finishes and before the next hypermetric chunk starts. I think an underrated aspect of Meshuggah's music is their ability and their attention to shaping dynamics and expectations. They have a lot of these build-ups to huge explosive moments, and I think this extra measure here makes such a big difference in hearing this section because it, you know, it's the boom, 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 boom. You know, it makes the payoff for that next riff so much more intense. Then things start to get a little bit spicier. The next riff is pretty much the same as that fusion riff that I just talked about, but with a couple differences. First, the texture is obviously different. So we're back to a full metal band with the cymbals pounding out the beat, distorted guitars, bass, the whole thing. The pitches are slightly changed from the previous version. They're almost all the same, except for one note. The second note is changed, actually. The pitch is changed. But other than that, they're all the same note, but starting with the first one, every other pitch is moved down an octave from how it was played in the first version of this riff. And when we're doing this, the low open strings don't figure into that every other note being down an octave thing. So I think the way to think about this is using this idea of isorhythm that I've talked about in other videos, but I'll recap quickly here because it's going to be a big deal in the rest of this video. So isorhythm is when you have more than one independent patterns happening at the same time. And that's the isorhythm when we map these different patterns onto each other and they're not the same length. So they're kind of like moving against each other in this weird, cool way. So if the first version sounded like this, the second one sounds like this. The letter names of the notes don't change, but the sound of the riff does change completely. The most notable thing, I think, is that instead of the overwhelmingly descending feel of the first version, this one feels a lot more like the chaotic, wide interval motion of some of the earlier riffs in this song. There's also a second layer added the second time through this riff, which moves pitches from the pattern up an octave instead of down, which is one of very few Meshuggah riffs I can think of where there are two guitar parts playing the same rhythm, the same riff, but with different pitches from each other. Although they're not that different because they're only different by an octave and only for some of the notes. It's not like they're suddenly doing like a Melodeath dual guitar harmony part or anything. And finally, compared to the snaky first version of this riff, the rhythmic pattern has changed. So instead of resetting the whole thing every 16 measures, it keeps the same rhythmic pattern. So again, that long, 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 short, long, 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 short, long, long, short, short. But it resets it every 8 measures. So there's a subtle change that makes the pattern just a little bit harder to track. So instead of being able to settle into that 4 long, 1 short, 4 long, 1 short, 2 long, 2 short pattern, for 7 full repetitions, it gets interrupted after only 3 full repetitions. Then we get to the last pair of riffs from this track before the long ambient interlude. This riff in particular was kind of a late entry into the running for being maybe my favorite riff on this track. There's so many riffs that I never really paid that much attention to this one until I started to learn it. But then I realized that it really just like hits you in the face like a truck. But when I dug into it and started seeing all the patterns, I loved it even more. So first of all, I realized that this is the same rhythmic pattern from the earlier riff that I called the hardest riff on the album. But with completely new pitches. So that pattern, using the same number notation that I used earlier, is this and sounds like this. What I said before about this pattern still applies,
except for the fact that it is actually not correct, what I said in the last video, because this long rhythmic pattern does repeat. So if we look at the line that says 6-3, if we cut that 6 into a 2 and then 4-3, so 2 longs and then 4 more longs, the rhythmic pattern does repeat. And wouldn't you know it, that's at exactly halfway through. If we're counting in beats, so 8 measures in. So contrary to what I said before, this rhythmic pattern does actually contain some internal repetition. It's actually twice through a long, non-repeating rhythmic pattern, not one big, long, even longer, non-repeating pattern.
I've started calling this one the
Snakes.
and Ladders riff, named after that board game for kids where you can like either you climb up the ladders and then oops, sometimes you get on
Snakes.
and you have to go back down. I call it that because it's a bunch of ascending whole tone fragments, so climbing up in pitch by step, sometimes getting stuck on a note twice, which is like a super cool choice, I think, that makes it sound like a malfunctioning machine, interspersed with free falls back down to the low open string, sometimes by way of a diminished triad. There are in the world 2 possible whole tone scales, and this riff uses both of them. The pitches will ascend with one whole tone scale, then jump back down, sometimes with the minor thirds, and then start ascending the other one. I'll call these the odd and even whole tone scales. So just based on the frets on the guitar, the odd scale uses 1, 3, 5, 7, and the even one uses 0, 2, 4, 6. Overall, these fragments are arranged in this really twisty pattern, which I'll try to explain generatively as if I was like trying to compose this from scratch. So we'll start with an ascending string on the odd whole tone scale. Then we'll restart and go up with another ascending string on the even whole tone scale. Then we get an expanded version of both fragments, followed by a diminished arpeggio back to the start. Then we start again, but get an extra time with the even whole tone scale at the end, then a longer version of the odd whole tone scale. Then we restart this whole chunk and play it the same until we get to the end of the second line where, or as I'm notating it in this diagram, where instead of sliding down the diminished scale, we just jump straight back to 0. Then after these almost repeats, that whole structure so far actually repeats verbatim until it gets cut off at the hypermetric boundary, so at the end of this longer rhythmic pattern. So here's the whole pitch pattern for this
Snakes
and ladders riff. This is just like such classic Catch-33, the way that there is some overall pattern and enough almost patterns within it that you can kind of go crazy trying to figure them out. And as I kind of hinted at before, this pitch pattern is an isorhythm, so it's mapped onto the rhythmic pattern from that earlier riff, which just like also makes it like really weird and kind of spirally sounding, really hard to pin down with your ear. So here is all of that. All right, one more riff, which is, in my opinion, just like such a conceptually cool last riff for this unbelievable stretch of music, because it adds yet another isorhythm sounding pattern on top of this riff by doing all of the same pitches, but also moving every other note up an octave, kind of like in that riff from earlier, the second version of the snaky riff. So just to kind of recap like what all the patterns that are happening here is, because it's easy to get stuck in these abstractions. We have a background 4/4 meter, which is articulated as usual by the cymbals on every beat, and the snare hits on beat 3. That's like one kind of basic pattern. That's outlining 16 measures. Then we have a non-repeating rhythmic pattern that fits within that 16 measure span of 4/4, but it doesn't really match up with it anywhere within that. It's all these dotted and undotted rhythmic values, and overall there's no pattern within that. Then we also have a pitch pattern that seems to repeat a few times and then actually does repeat, but it doesn't have the same number of items as the rhythmic pattern. So when it's mapped onto that, it repeats and moves with respect to this rhythmic pattern, and which itself is also floating against the steady 4/4 beat. And that pitch pattern is also truncated at the same time as the rhythmic pattern at the hypermetric boundary. And then finally, there's yet another independent 2-item pattern of octave displacement that is mapped on top of all of this at the same time. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that this might be the most theory-rich Meshuggah riff that I have spent time with, just in the sense of how many different identifiable pattern-like things are happening at the same time, and how dense the like informational determinism of this is, like how many different structures that leave their mark on this one stretch of music. And as if that wasn't cool enough, we also get the subtle tremolo picking pattern in the background that was originally from the first riff of In Death Is Life. I haven't talked about these tremolo patterns in this series very much, or maybe even at all, but they're all over the album, and these 2 tracks in particular, and bringing back this one is yet another way of kind of bookending this long stretch of music, starting with In Death Is Life, and ending with this part before the ambient part in Death is Death. So here is all of that in this last riff. I should talk about what might seem like the elephant in the room to some, which is that all of this is pretty much impossible to hear, especially if you're trying to track all the patterns at once. Even when I'd been playing this riff for almost a year, I didn't catch the pitch pattern or realize that this and the previous riff were all the same pitches. It was only when I rebarred everything and sat down to look at the tab and make notes that I noticed that, like, oh man, these are actually the same pitches, just with this octave pattern locked in. And then, oh yeah, this is the same rhythmic pattern as that riff from much earlier. And you know, it's all happening together. The patterns are so strange and so long, and they get even harder to hear when they're mapped onto the rhythmic pattern and the octave displacement pattern, that it's really hard to try and track more than one pattern at the same time. Overall, this riff ends up sounding a lot like the first riff in the song, because both of them alternate between high and low pitches, but with some rhythmic hiccups. But trying to hear these patterns directly probably misses the point. One easy rebuttal to the like critique, if you want to call it that, of saying, you can't hear the patterns, what are you doing talking about this, is that the patterns are a compositional process, something that's meant to generate this kind of randomish sounding riff, and the final product sounds cool, so the scaffolding they use doesn't really matter, but it is fun to look at, and it is valid to look at like what the compositional process was. But another interesting way of thinking about this, I think, is that knowing that the pattern is there makes this riff more fun to listen to, or makes it sound more important, or gives it more of a feeling of closure, or maybe listening to it feels more like being lost in the maze, even if you can't hear the patterns directly. So kind of to say that again, knowing that there is a pattern and listening to this riff does change how you hear it, even if you are not able to actually hear what the pattern is while you're listening. Even if if I play it for you and we listen, I stop it and I say, okay, where are you in the pitch pattern? Even if you can't track that, or track where you are in the rhythm pattern, or definitely not do both at the same time, that still doesn't mean that the pattern doesn't affect your hearing, if that makes sense. Because I know that it's there, I know that there's something going on, and that makes it like cooler to listen to. This is maybe the furthest that Meshuggah went during their career so far, fingers crossed, into this type of pattern-based, intricately composed style of riff writing. And I think the effect is really cool. It's been so fun for me to uncover all of these traces of the compositional process in this music that I already knew really well by ear, but I hadn't sat down and looked for connections in. So a few videos ago in this series, Daniel Crawford, my hero/friend, said that I should do a full playthrough of In Death is Death, and I took that personally. So here instead is a full playthrough of In Death is Life and In Death is Death, with all guitar parts and bass and drums. I know the secret's probably ruined. There's no surprise at this moment because I'm gonna put it in the title of the video, but you can act surprised that it won't cost you anything. Huge thanks to Danny J and CJ Yakub for joining me in this endeavor. Check out links to their projects in the description. I'm also going to post a version with vocals as a separate video eventually, once I get my vocal chops up to that, with some little reflections about what it was like to learn and perform this. So without further ado, here is what we've been practicing for the last 6 months or so. What are you still doing here? Time to go to bed. Honk shoe, me, 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 me. See ya.